Good morning and welcome to all of you that are here today, and especially to our online viewers. And we would also like to welcome all of our newcomers who weren't able to be here for any of our previous sessions. They have been a true blessing, and if you missed any of them, please refer to the QR code and the website that we have up here, because up there they'll have all of our live streams as well as our any archived videos from this weekend. And we also want to let you know that there is going to be a opportunity to ask questions for a Q&A session that's going to be happening this evening. And if you aren't able to access the website, you can also write your questions down. There's going to be some forms that are going to be out in the foyer. And you can just write your question and then to who you want to ask the question to. And we just hope that you'll be blessed.
Yes, and it's my privilege to introduce to you our speaker for this session. Ron Duffield is a coworker of mine, and I consider him a friend. And he is a husband, father, respiratory therapist, and author with a passion for Advent history, righteousness by faith, and liberty of conscience.
Amen. Amen. Well, good morning and happy Sabbath. Thank you for coming and joining in this weekend of Liberty of Conscience. And again, the title of the weekend is When Tyranny Returns. Now, last night, Jay talked about kind of where liberty comes from. It's from the Creator himself. And we're involved in a great controversy where that has been challenged for the last 6,000 years. And the devil uses many means, including evolution, to undermine the Creator concept and ultimately liberty. And then Jay and Ricky talked a little bit about the beginnings of the Reformation, where that idea of liberty of conscience sprang forth, and then the foundation of this country, which I believe was a divine act of God, really. To bring people together and to agree on a constitution is amazing. And so today's topic for today's talk is going to be up on the screen here shortly. And it is the title is Echoes of the Dragon, Challenges to Liberty in the 1840s to the 1890s. And so we're going to look at some of the challenges in the past. Now, this isn't just dry, dusty history for the sake of telling a story. It's so that when we look at the past, we can ask, is it being repeated again today? How did they respond then? How should we respond today? And it should give us courage to where we are in this whole scope of the great controversy. So let's start by just kind of summarizing what Ricky talked about this morning, and that was the purpose and the reason for the founding of this country. This is from the book. This from a Signs of the Times article. It says, "Those who first found an asylum on the shores of America rejoiced that they had reached a country free from the arrogant claims of popery and the tyranny of kingly rule. They determined to establish government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberty." And I think that's something we have to remember. In my mind, growing up in a Christian home, an Adventist home, I always, knew about religious liberty I thought of, but I always just applied it to one thing, and that was an issue over the day of worship. But liberty of conscience is very broad. And if we don't recognize it as very broad, we won't recognize when our liberties are being taken away, which has happened, and especially in the last 3 years. Well, it was during those first early years, actually, of this country that the Second Great Awakening happened in a land of freedom. The Second Great Awakening actually is dated as from about the 1790s up through the 1840s, and toward the end of the 1840s began what we understand as the Second Great Advent Movement. William Miller was a Baptist preacher, and he began to proclaim particularly prophecies, Revelation 14, a message from the first angel that the hour of God's judgment had come, or was about to be here, and Get ready, Jesus is coming. That was the message. But it's interesting, John Loughborough, who was alive during that time, it wasn't just a Baptist preacher only. This is what Loughborough says. Elder William Miller had the names and addresses of 3,000 ministers in various parts of the globe who were proclaiming, "Fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment is come." That's Revelation 14. The greater portion of these being in North America and Great Britain. So we often think of William Miller as the only one. There was 3,000, according to William Miller, around this country that were preaching this message, and from many other denominations. And this is where that message began to go, not just in the United States, but around the world. But something happened in the early 1840s. It came to the point where many of the churches, and again, not just one denomination, didn't want to hear anymore. And cancel culture began to take place. It's exactly what it was. 50,000 people, I have read, were kicked out of their own churches simply for believing and proclaiming a message of Christ's return. And that created, it wasn't just that created it, but other issues in the country as well began a moral decline in this country. And I never realized how deep and broad this moral decline was until I started looking into this last year. And even secular writers talk about this moral decline. In fact, there's an article written by a lady for her undergraduate work, and the title of it is Wicked California, 1848 to 1860s. And she describes in this article, a fairly long article, just how far in the state of California morality had fallen. And it's really not a good read. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But the prostitution and the alcohol, drunkenness, and gambling, and all, you name it, was all taking place. And it wasn't just among the people, it was among the clergy. In fact, she tells a story of a young man. He wanted to go to a Sunday afternoon entertainment where there would be a bull and a bear fighting. There would be gambling based on, who's going to win this battle. And there would be, of course, drinking and carousing and all of this. But he felt a little guilty. So he decided to go to church that day first, go to Mass, and then he could attend the entertainment that evening. And then he describes his dismay as when he goes to the entertainment that night or that afternoon, the same clergy was there attending. And this is what he says. He says, "It was a strange metamorphosis he, the priest, had undergone since the morning. Only 4 hours had elapsed since I saw him officiating at the altar and feasting upon a substance which he believed to be the actual flesh and blood of Jesus Christ." So there was definitely a moral decline in this country, and it wasn't just those secular people. It involved religious people as well. Well, other people write about this. Uriah Smith, in his book, Marvel of the Nations, talking about the United States, describes this moral fall. And he says, the people of the United States are not all saints. The masses, notwithstanding all our gospel light and gospel privileges, are still in a position for Satan to suddenly fire their hearts with the basest of impulses. And I think he was describing well what the conditions were. He continues, wealth leads to luxury, luxury to corruption, to the breaking down of the moral barriers, and then the way is open for the worst passions to come to the front and for the worst principles to bear rule. So you see what happened when restraint from God's law to protect us, when that restraint is removed, and I'm talking about our own personal restraint, it opens the door for the basest passions. And so this is indeed was what was taking place. And then Uriah Smith describes some of the things that were coming into this country in these years following 1844. In addition to this, we have spiritualism, infidelity, socialism, free love, the trade unions or labor against capital, communism, all assiduously spreading their principles among the masses. These are the very principles that worked among the people as the exciting cause just prior to the terrible French Revolution of 1789 to 1800. Human nature is the same in all ages, and like causes will surely produce like effect. And we can't forget that last sentence there that he says, when we see the same powers or the same movements in effect today, we can be sure that the result will be the same, just as it was in the French Revolution. So you have a situation where you have a great awakening spiritually, followed then by moral decline, which set up this opportunity for all of these ideologies to come in. Jay mentions Darwin's theory came around 1844 and began to be pushed, as well as communism and socialism and all these things. I had no idea this was happening in the mid-1800s. Well, it was in the midst of this then, this very time, when the message to the Laodicean church was first applied to us as a people, as well as Protestant churches. And you'll find this in an article in the Review, 1852, where Ellen White says, many who profess to be looking for the speedy coming of Christ are becoming conformed to this world, and seek more earnestly the applause of those around them than the approbation of God. They are cold and formal like the nominal church that they but a short time since separated from. The words addressed to the Laodicean church describe their present condition perfectly, and then she references Revelation 3. A church that doesn't know they're poor, miserable, blind, and naked, but thinks they're rich and increased with goods. And you notice this is the setting, though, the world setting in which the Advent movement coming out of that Great Awakening was coming up. And it was a tendency for many to become worldly, like the world around them. And yes, is that not just like today? Well, what effect did this have then on politics? And maybe this is a question of the chicken or the egg first, right? Is it corrupt moral conditions in the country that leads to corruption in politics? Or is it corruption in politics that leads to a more moral decay of society? I would suggest it's both. It's kind of a circular thing. The worse society gets, then it produces moral decadence in politicians, which increases the moral drop in society. And again, Uriah Smith talks about this condition also in those years in the 1800s. Political corruption is preparing the way for deeper sin, he said. It pervades all parties. It wasn't just one, left or right, it was all parties. Look at the dishonest means resorted to obtain office, the bribery, the deception, the ballot stuffing. It's not new. Well, Ellen White wrote about this as well. She said, there is danger, decided danger, for all who shall link themselves up with the political parties of the world. There is fraud on both sides. God has given government a place. Jay talked about it last night. But we are not to get involved with parties to solve the problems of the world today. God has a much more powerful way to deal with those problems, and it's through the Jesus Christ, who lived it out 2,000 years ago, and we can see it in his life. There's fraud on both sides. God has not laid upon any of our people the burden of linking up with either party. We are under Christ's banner, and everyone who names the name of Christ is to depart from all iniquity. And I think that's a warning for us today. And I don't have time to go in, but I think many of the pioneers, they saw the problems, but they stepped back rather than getting involved politically in trying to deal with the problem. Well, James Wright wrote an article, very interesting title. It was called Pope or President. The title of a book written in 1859 by a Protestant warning of the liberal moral decline in the country and pointing to papal influence leading into this problem. talked a lot about slavery, how much of the push for slavery was coming from popery in this country. Very interesting. But in the middle of this article, James White then addresses an interesting problem that this brings up. So he addresses the liberal issues going on in the country, and then he has this to say. A political party styled the American or Know-Nothing Party attempted to grapple with the impending evil, but ignominiously failed, chiefly on account of its undemocratic attitude, which placed it in hostility, not simply to the hierarchical rule of popery, but to all foreigners indiscriminately. The false position of this party has done a great disservice to the cause of Protestantism by the reaction that it has naturally caused. So note, you see the problem. There's an issue of slavery, and liberal people are backing that. And here's a party that was only around for about a year in the 1850s called the Know-Nothing Party. That was obviously their nickname that others applied to them. But they were so radical in their attempts to bring about change that it actually did more harm than good. And James White brought this out in his article, The Pope or President. Well, in the middle of this, 1863, the Seventh-day Adventist Church officially formed. So people from Baptist and Methodist and Christian Connection, Presbyterian, came together and joined and became what we know today as the Seventh-day Adventist Church, 1863. It's interesting to note the timing of this, but that very same year, the National Reform Association formed on February 4, 1863. This was a small grassroots movement, Protestants primarily, and they were concerned about what was going on in this country. And notice this is what Eric Syme says as he summarizes it. He says, the secularizing of America in the 1860s disturbed Protestant Americans who feared that liberals were de-Christianizing the country. To organize support, they formed the National Reform Association. And in Ohio, on February 4, 1863, a principal speaker, John Alexander, emphasized that slavery and the consequent Civil War grew out of America's original failure to acknowledge God's authority in the national Constitution. So you see the problem here. Did they have legitimate concerns with what the moral decline in this country? Yes. But their very name describes where their focus is. National reform through attempting to change government in order to change the people, which is exactly backwards. And the Civil War was not the result of having a constitution that wasn't written correctly. It was the result of not following the Constitution that was written correctly. Well, less than 1 year later, the National Reform Association wrote their constitution for their organization. And notice right off how they start. They say, and this is Article 2, the object of this society shall be to maintain existing Christian features in the American government, to promote needed reforms in the action of the government, touching on the Sabbath, Sunday, they mean Sunday, the institution of the family, they would later add the word marriage, the religious element in education, the oath, meaning in a court setting, promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, so help me God, and public morality as affected by the liquor traffic and other kindred evils, to secure such an amendment to the Constitution of the United States as will declare the nation's allegiance to Jesus Christ and its acceptance of the moral law of the Christian religion, and so indicate that this is a Christian nation. So again, I ask, did they have legitimate concerns? When you read through their list of issues they have, the decay of the family, the education, the liquor traffic, and so forth, they did have concerns. But where are they turning to fix the problem? And here's the sad thing. There was many churches involved in slavery as it was. Here's Douglas Morgan wrote an article in Liberty Magazine, very good. He summarizes again this issue. The general ethos or values shared by the leading Protestant denominations remained the dominant moral influence in the late 19th century America. But manifold and rapidly accelerating dangers threatened that dominance. And then notice this list and tell me if it will apply today. If it applies today. The crime, vice, poverty, rampant in overcrowded cities. Could we add homelessness in there? The huge influx of immigrants boosting the power base of Roman Catholicism, the influence of secular values in the university, and the large corporations that held sway over the new industrial economy. In response, the Christian Nation Advocates, or the Christian Lobby, or the NRA, sought to advance the reign of Christ over the nation by federal legislation. So again, you see this scenario. There's moral decline. The response by the NRA is to institute something through changing the Constitution. By the way, you can go onto the website from the National Reform Association, just went on it a couple days ago, and the website's still there, and they have the same mission today. To have an amendment to the Constitution to make, Jesus Christ King and Supreme Governor of the United States. Well, less than, about 3 years later, they started a magazine called the Christian Statesman, and I think this was a bi-monthly magazine. And through the articles in this Christian statement, you can see their thoughts and what they stood for. And sometimes they would have speakers at their conventions. They would publish their works or their preaching in the Christian Statesman and also as pamphlets on their own. And this particular one was by Dr. John Edwards, not the John Edwards we know from the 1700s. And this is what he said in 1873. In a speech in a National Reform Convention, Jonathan Edwards said, "We want state and religion, and we're going to have it. Now we are warned that to engraft this doctrine upon the Constitution will be oppressive, that it will infringe the rights of conscience, and we are told that there are atheists and deists and Jews and Seventh-day Baptists who would be sufferers under it." And it's true. They were and would be sufferers under this constitutional change. Edwards goes on, "These are all," speaking of that group of people, "for the occasion, and so far as our amendment is concerned, one class. They use the same arguments and the same tactics against us. What are the rights of the atheist? I would tolerate him as I would tolerate a poor lunatic, for in my view, his mind is scarcely sound." So if you fell into any of those groups, including Jew or Seventh-day Baptist or Seventh-day Adventist, you were all thrown into the basket of poor lunatic. And this is how the NRA began to address those that didn't agree with their church and state push. But they would talk out of both sides of their mouth, just as today, I would suggest. You see this happen. Here's an article 1 year later. It says, "From the beginning of the National Reform Movement, they," speaking of groups that worshiped on the seventh day, "have regarded it as the first step toward the persecution which they, as observers of the seventh day, will endure when our Sabbath laws are revived and enforced. One can but smile at their apprehension of the success of a movement who would not harm a hair of their heads, but their fears were sincere enough for all that." So on the one hand, they put out scathing rebukes and remarks, but then say there's nothing to fear, almost kind of in a scoffing way. They have really nothing to fear. And this you can trace through the articles of the Christian Statesman. Here's another example, 1885. "We might add, in all justice," this speaker said, Reverend E.B. Graham, "if the opponents of the Bible do not like our government and its Christian features, Let them go to some wild, desolate land, and in the name of the devil and for the sake of the devil, subdue it, set up a government of their own on infidel and atheistic ideas, and then if they can stand it, stay there till they die. Is that how Jesus treated those who didn't believe in him when he was here on earth? Not at all. So again, legitimate concerns about the moral decay of the country, but trying to fix it through the devil's methods. That's really what it boils down to. And with the cynical attitude that the devil uses. Well, this created, and I want to really try to lay the groundwork of I think what we're facing today. This created an interesting situation where you had this left versus right. Uriah Smith spends almost 20 pages pointing out this situation that was taking place in the 1860s and on. He says the opposition to the religious amendment manifested in many parts of the country, especially by the liberal or infidel element, is thought by many to be an insuperable barrier in the way of its success. But if we mistake not, this is the very stimulus which will excite its friends to such an exertion that it will ultimately be secured. What's he saying? Some people say, okay, the National Reform movement is trying to join church and state, and the response by infidels is going to stop that from happening. And Uriah Smith says, actually not. The response by liberal side will actually spur the other side to go even farther in making sure that it takes place. In other words, the pendulum will swing farther and farther as time goes on. Uriah Smith continues, for the liberal opposition assumes such an aggressive attitude that no neutral ground is left. An irrepressible conflict is precipitated. It must be victory or defeat of the most decisive kind, and for either party, right? The government must become nominally wholly Christian or in reality wholly secular. And by the way, Ricky brought this up. This is what was going on in the time of Christ. The devil offers two extreme choices. Which one do you want? Either way, he's got you and me. And this is what was going on in our country in the 1800s. And then Uriah Smith now lists, here's a liberal conference, a gathering of liberals who wrote up their own demands in response to the NRA. In opposition to the National Reform movement, liberalism sets forth its sweeping antagonistic demands in the following platform. And then I'm just going to go quickly through a whole list of them and question whether we don't see some of the same things being said today. We demand that our churches shall no longer be exempt from just taxation. We demand that the employment of chaplains in Congress and state legislators supported by public money shall be discontinued. We demand that all religious services now sustained by the government shall be abolished, and especially that the use of the Bible in public schools. We demand that the appointment of all religious festivals and fasts shall wholly cease. You know, no more, I guess they would say, Christmas or Easter. And we demand that the judicial oath in the courts and in other departments of the government shall be abolished. We demand that the laws directly or indirectly enforcing the observance of Sunday as the Sabbath shall be repealed. Now, they have a point there, but the motivation is more from the standpoint of loss of income than it is from a religious standpoint. We demand that all laws looking to the enforcement of Christian morality shall be abrogated, and that all laws shall be conformed to the requirements of, notice, natural morality, equal rights, and impartial liberty. These are all catchphrases for literally what we see going on in our country today. We demand that not only in the Constitution of the United States and in several states shall be founded and administered on purely secular basis. NRA responds, let's join church and state, and now liberal response is even more radical in that direction. Notice what Uriah Smith says, but it might be well to inquire, what has given liberalism its recent impulse toward the secularization of the state? It is not the national reform movement itself, or is it not? We heard nothing about the demands of liberalism nor their especially aggressive work till the amendment began to seek the aid of the civil power in behalf of religious customs and dogmas. So this is really actually quite amazing. In other words, what has driven liberalism to its response was a response by the religious right in the years preceding, and the pendulum began to swing. Uriah Smith continues, this naturally threw the liberalists into an active defensive movement under the menace of loss of civil rights. Thus, the amendmentists find that they have conjured up a demon which they would now fain exorcise. Neither party can recede from the position it has taken. The crisis must now come. So you see how this pushing farther and farther away was happening? And through that avenue, the devil was seeking to destroy not only this country, but the world, and pulling it back into a church situation. It got so to the point, Uriah Smith even talks about a pastor in Kansas who went to an NRA conference, and he was willing to suggest that even a civil war and shedding of blood was worth pushing through this amendment to the Constitution. This liberal movement, this pastor thinks, can be met only by the amendment movement of the National Reform Party, and he leaves it to be inferred that if the success of this movement costs even as great a sacrifice as the suppression of our late political rebellion cost, he's talking about the Civil War, the sacrifice should be made rather than that the religious amendment movement should fail. So in other words, we'll even shed blood in order to push through this church-state movement in order to Christianize America. This is what was happening. Well, in 1879, something changed. For about 15 years, the NRA had been trying, the National Reform Association had been trying to change nationally the Constitution of the United States. Now their attention, they decided, would be better to go state by state and deal with the issues that way. And so they did. Although the National Reform Association had failed, it had developed a sufficient public support to begin carefully prepared Sunday enforcement drive to build massive public support in each state. And so that's exactly what they did. Many of the states already had laws on the books, especially, the eastern states. Where did they start? Pennsylvania. Interesting. Was the logical starting point for the NRA's Sunday Crusade. This populous and influential state already had largely unenforced Sunday law, which reform representatives tried to reactivate. In January 1879, the NRA began to pressure the lawmakers, and the legislation eventually voted the bill into law. It happened that quickly. Didn't work federally yet, but state by state, they began to go and encourage and pressure, and more people began to join as they saw the decay of society around them. Well, you recognize this town, Dayton, Washington Territory, not too far from here. 1882, Dayton, Washington. Alonzo Jones was doing an evangelistic series there in Dayton, and they didn't have a cafeteria or a building there where they could serve meals, so they hired someone from the local community to kind of do a chuck wagon setup or something to that effect. And notice what happened. The brethren did not wish to have the care of the provision stand, and the privilege was obtained by a citizen of Dayton. On Sunday, he had a good run of custom, as a large number of people was on the ground who, of course, wanted something to eat. But on Monday, he had to pay a fine of $25 for violating the Sunday law of the territory. This law was recently enacted and is very stringent. So here's, even in Washington Territory, 1882, 3 years after the NRA begins to push state by state, and Sunday laws in almost every state of this country were being enforced, one way or another. And it happened in the little town of Dayton, not too far from here. It's still on the books. As far as I know, all of this is still on the books. It's just unenforced. Oakland, California, 1882. Joseph Wagner and W.C. White were among the 1,600 Californians arrested between March and June of '82 for violating Sunday laws. The Pacific Press Company was also shut down. There were so many people arrested in San Francisco, part of this 1,600, that the warden had to go to the state and say, stop, we have nowhere to put all of these Sunday violators. We don't have room for the actual criminals to put. So this is the result of that movement that took place, which was the result of moral decay, pendulum response on the right, pendulum response on the left, and back and forth until it reached this point. This is a slide I made many years ago. I need to update it because the numbers aren't correct, but starting in about 1878, these are just representing Seventh-day Adventists who were arrested for Sunday law violations. I'm finding now the numbers are much bigger than are shown there on this slide. And this one has a lot of information. I'm not going to go over it piece by piece, but these are the countries during these years, not just the United States, where there was an agitation in regard to Sunday law issues. That's how quickly a movement can spread around the world. Just a few years ago, Miriam Cho was finishing up her law degree. She worked for the General Conference, and she went through state by state and collected all the state Sunday laws that are still on the books. Every state but Alaska. And some of them are, just for you can't sell liquor on that day, you can't do anything of a legal nature on Sunday. The last sentence there, she says, at first glance, these restrictions may seem irrelevant to religious liberty. However, the rationale behind these restrictions is hardly innocuous. In other words, the reasoning behind how they got put there is dangerous, and how quickly that could all change today. It doesn't take some big movement to come up with laws. They're already there. Well, 1884, the book, The Great Controversy, this was the first time it was actually published in a 4-volume set. This was volume 4, greatly expanded from earlier edition, 1864. And notice how Ellen White describes the fulfillment of prophecy in 1884. In the movements now in progress in this country to secure for the institutions and usages of the church the support of the state, Protestants are following in the steps of papists. Nay, more, they are opening the door to popery to regain in Protestant America the supremacy which she had lost in the old world. Now, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I truly believe that the decline in America, both liberal and conservative, have one source. First of all, the devil himself, but the movements afoot, I believe, have the waymarks of the past. And notice when she writes, in the movements now, she's referring to then, 1884. That's what was happening. Men are closing their eyes to the real character of Romanism and the dangers to be apprehended from her supremacy. The people of our land need to be aroused to resist the advances of this most dangerous foe, and then notice, to civil and religious liberty. Now, I know I've talked a lot about Sunday laws, but during this time, there was a lot of speaking out in regard to civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of press. And you would find many of the pioneers writing on this in our papers. It wasn't just Sunday laws. Off in the future, they were concerned about. It was both civil and religious liberties that were being removed. And then this well-known, we've read this many times, probably in our lifetime, through the two great errors, the immortality of the soul and Sunday sacredness, Satan will bring the people under his deception. While the former lays the foundation of spiritualism, the latter creates a bond of sympathy with Rome. Protestantism will yet stretch her hand across the gulf to grasp the hand of spiritualism. She will reach over the abyss to clasp the hands of Roman power, and under the influence of this threefold union, our country will follow in the steps of Rome in trampling on the rights of conscience. Now, I know sometimes in our day, when we look out, it seems impossible that these three groups could ever come together. But that's probably what people would have said 2,000 years ago when Sadducee and Pharisee were fighting and both, to one degree or another, hated the government. How all three could join in a church-state union has happened and will happen again, even if it doesn't appear so. When each side is actuated by the principles of Satan, they will find common ground at some point. That was 84 when that book was released. This is December 11, 84. Christian Statesman article said, whenever they, the Roman Catholics, are willing to cooperate in resisting the progress of political asylum, we will gladly join hands with them. That statement, prophetic statement, was fulfilled that very year. Encyclical came out 85, written to all Catholics that they should do all in their power to cause the constitution of states and legislation to be molded on the principles of the true church. And that was happening. Full support of what was going on. What about spiritualism? Where were they? This is actually the official paper at that time, 86, called the Banner of Light. And here a spirit medium actually got in contact with someone or something on the other side, dark side, and asked the question, what about Sunday sacredness? Is that a command from God? And this was the response from the other world. It is a law of nature that man should have a period of such rest. The Sabbath day was not decreed by any command of Jehovah. It is only an outgrowth of the common sense of man speaking through the outer world. So, of course, don't believe it's from Jehovah, but it's just the evolution of man. But do you see how spiritualism could easily join even with a group that they don't agree with in their ideology? And this was all taking place during that time. Well, 1886, that same year, the American Sentinels began. And this paper, which is now called Liberty Magazine, the co-editors were E.J. Wagner and A.T. Jones. And the January 1886 issue makes it clear why they started this paper. They said, it is well known that there is a large and influential association in the United States bearing the name National Reform Association. While there are many people in the land who are opposed to or look with suspicion upon the movements of this party, there is no paper published in the United States which has for its distinct object the vindication of the rights of American citizens. Not just our rights, but the rights of American citizens, and by extension, the rights of people around the world. And that's why this paper was started, which we solemnly believe are threatened by the actions and aims of this association. The back page of that first edition, there was actually an advertisement for the paper itself, and it describes what its purposes are for. It's for the preservation of the United States Constitution as it is, so far as regards religion or religious test, and the maintenance of human rights, both civil and religious. So this paper didn't, again, just deal with Sunday laws, which we're more focused on in this hour, but it dealt with civil issues as well. Well, 1888, just 2 years after the Sentinel was released, and by the way, the sale of that little paper that started there at Pacific Press in California mushroomed. By October of '88, because of what was going on in the country, 290,000 copies were sold just of the October issue in 1888. And they were getting over 25,000 orders per week. God was using it. Well, 1888, the National Reform Party was joined by 3 other groups. 2 of them in '87, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the American Sabbath, and the Prohibition Party. And now there were 4 groups together, and their power was enormous. This is how Charles Snow, he lived during that time. He wrote in his book, published in 1914, Religious Liberty in America. While in 1883 there was one obscure organization advocating these un-American principles, in 1888 there were 4, and each of the 3 editions was capable of wielding a greater influence among the people at large than the parent organization. So this was the momentum of this movement that was happening in the United States. Well, May of 1888, the National Reform finally found a senator that was willing to try to push through a bill, not for a state law, but for a national law. And so bill number 2983, which was a national Sunday law, and their stated reason was the national law is needed to make the state laws complete and effective. So 79 to 88, look how quickly that went through. And a few days later, May 25, another bill was put before the senators, and it was for the amendment to the Constitution. The idea in this was to establish the Christian religion as a religion of the nation, and this to the exclusion of all other religions. So this is how far from our founding fathers this country reached in 1888. So let's again just back up and summarize what was going on. And this is the point that I want us to see for today. God sent a message, the Great Awakening, the Great Advent Movement in the 1790s that then culminated in the 1840's. There was a rejection of that by many churches, and cancel culture put in place. 50,000 at least people were kicked out of their home churches, and there was a moral decline in the country. And again, I say it has many, many reasons for that. In response, about 20 years later, the National Reform Association begins and seeks to change the Constitution in order to change the moral decline. Legitimate issues, but going about it the wrong way. In response, the liberal movement says no way and pushes back radically, and in response, the National Party pushes even harder from the other direction, and it culminates basically in 1888 and the years following. So where are we today in this country and in the world? Have we seen the same pendulum swing in the last 50 years, even in this country? Oh, yeah. Sexual revolution, 1850s, 60s, 70s, all that came in there. A rise of the religious right, which wanted to change all of that, legitimately so, but again, going back to seeking to instigate it through the government. And in the last 20 years, we've seen this drastic moral decline even farther, almost demanding that there be no religion in the country. And my question is, how far are we away from the reciprocal response? Very close. So this behooves us then, as Christian Seventh-day Adventists believing in liberty of conscience, to not wait longer to recognize what's going on. To stand up now. Stand up against the decadence. Stand up against the response that seeks to have government enforce religion and to show that there's only one divine being or Godhead through the Holy Spirit to transform lives. Now's the time to recognize it. Not to get involved politically. Yes, recognize and stand up for causes, but not join a political party so that we cut ourselves off from being able to witness and befriend and warn people no matter what side they're on. And lastly, to avoid the cynicism and the attitude, the leaven that Jesus called it, that undermines both radical extremes. And I say that because I'm concerned of my own self. When I see, movements in our country, it rises up within me kind of the same, perhaps, attitude that the disciples struggled with. Lord, shall we call down fire, destroy them? Or get the sword out to lop off a few heads? Peter only got an ear, and the saddest part is that a few hours later, he denied his Lord with cussing and swearing. And unless we're actuated by Christ's Spirit, now we're not going to be actuated by Christ's Spirit when times get worse, which I believe are right before us. What do you say? Yeah. Let's pray. Father, we thank you that you have given us this history, both as a warning and as an education for what we are facing today. Lord, may we see in the movements, not just religious in nature, but civil in nature, where rights and liberties are being taken away left and right. Lord, may we be awake to the times we're living in. May we not wait until we read about a Sunday law in the morning paper to say it's time to be friends with our neighbors and with our co-workers and to try to make a difference in the world that we're living in. And Lord, most of all, keep us from partaking in the spirit of Satan during this time, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. This afternoon, I would just invite you to come and hear more presentations, not only for church service as well, but for this afternoon as Jay will continue to deal with then more of the specifics of what we're facing today. God bless you, and the church service will start shortly hereafter.
Hello, my name is James Ash, and I want to thank you for watching State Line Advent Media. If you like what you saw today, make sure and check out our content on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, or Gab. All you have to do is type in State Line Advent Media, and it should pop right up to the surface. Remember to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to find out more information how you can partner together with us in our ministry, go to www.statelineadventmedia.org. Thank you and God bless.